Okay, everybody, thanks for your patience. My name is Caitlin Yeager, Director of Heritage Programs for Missouri Humanities. Our mission is to enrich lives and strengthen communities by connecting Missourians with the people, places, and ideas that shape our society. Thank you so much for joining us today for our three-part community engagement workshop, part of our Cultural Heritage Workshop program, dedicated to providing tools and resources necessary for communities to reevaluate cultural heritage assets, improve community involvement, and increase tourism and economic development opportunities. We are about to jump into our third and final webinar of the day with Christina Miller and Daniel Reeder of the Missouri State Archives, and they'll be presenting about creating and sustaining an effective volunteer program. Earlier today, we were joined by Missouri Humanities Director of Communications and Marketing, Mandy Jean Redder, who presented about social media and marketing engagement, as well as Chris Kemke of Extension, who discussed interregional cooperation and creating critical mass. If you missed either of these programs, they are both available on our Facebook page under our videos tab, and will also be available on our website and YouTube channel probably sometime next week. Whether you are joining us through Zoom or watching on Facebook Live, we invite you to be part of the conversation. If you're on Facebook, feel free to comment to let us know you're watching or to ask questions for us to consider. If you're on Zoom, feel free to submit questions using the chat feature or the Q&A feature, and we'll try to answer as many as possible towards the end of the program. If you enjoyed our program today and are interested in seeing more from Missouri Humanities, please check us out on Facebook or on our website for the most up-to-date information about our events. We also have a great membership program where benefits include free books, discounted tickets to special programs, and access to members-only events. To become a member, visit mohumanities.org and click the Become a Member button on the right-hand corner of the screen. At the conclusion of this webinar, a survey will pop up on your screen. I would really appreciate it if you could take the time to let us know what you thought of the presentation. These surveys are very important as we continue to bring public programming to Missourians and work toward a more thoughtful, informed, and civil society. So with that, I will turn this over to Christina, who will start us off on the first half of the presentation. Christina is the Reference Services Manager at the Missouri State Archives. And then we'll turn it over to Daniel, who is the Research Analyst and eVolunteer Coordinator for the State Archives. So Christina, I'll let you go ahead and get going.
All right, thank you everyone. We're excited to have you join us for creating and sustaining an effective volunteer program. For those of you not familiar with the Missouri State Archives, we are the official repository for Missouri state government records. We were created by the legislature in 1965. Although the Secretary of State's office, whom we are a part of, has been the official record holder since statehood. So our holdings date from about 1770 and include records from all branches of government. Plus we have a lot of county and municipal records on microfilm. We hold like 336 million pages of paper, although we've never counted them all. That's kind of an estimate. Over 770,000 photographs, lots of maps, microfilm, audio-visual records. And we have a fairly decent online presence and have made a lot of our records available in numerous ways. And the main reason we've been able to do that is because of volunteers. We have a very strong volunteer corps. We're fairly lucky that we've had volunteers basically since we opened in 1965. I actually can't prove that. I don't know that for sure, but I have seen photographs of volunteers from the early 1970s. So I figure it's probably fairly accurate. People tend to be interested in our records, so they tend to want to make them available because they can't use them until they're available. So we're very lucky in that we've had a pretty strong volunteer corps, and that I haven't had to start a volunteer corps and I've just had to kind of help manage the one we already have. So that's kind of a little bit about us. We get our volunteers in a few different ways. Our volunteers are primarily retirees. I think this is true for most organizations. We get a lot of former school teachers, hobbyists, or people who have an interest in local history or genealogy. If you're a membership organization, often your volunteers will be members of your organization in some capacity. We do have a friends group, and that sometimes funnels in volunteers, but that's not necessarily just because you're a volunteer does not mean you're a member of our friends group. Although it does tend to make you a little bit more interested in being a member of our friends group. I will say that. But we also get students who need volunteer hours, both at the high school and the college level, and that's worked out fairly well. But one of the biggest draws we have right now is our local DAR, Daughters of the American Revolution chapter. DAR chapters will often track volunteer hours specifically on records projects. So not necessarily for docent purposes or exhibit purposes, but their goal as a national organization is to volunteer to make records projects more accessible, to help make records easier to find, to prove DAR membership. And so we have quite a few members, volunteers who are members of the local DAR chapter who volunteer with us. And then interns are another kind of volunteer base that you can use if you partner with a local university or college, or even students who live locally in the summer, but that go to school elsewhere, but need some hours. So we draw our volunteers from all of those locations. We advertise regularly in our local paper. There's a free volunteer opportunity selection section. And so things are always listed online, and then they rotate who they're publishing in the local paper. They have a set number of lines. And so our ad runs like about once a month. We can always tell when it runs because we get a call. We've kind of paused it for COVID because we are limited in how much space we have, how many people can come in right now. So we don't want too many new volunteers. Plus with retirees as volunteers, generally that's a more at-risk population, so you don't get as many volunteers willing to come in and do in-person volunteering. We also send out notifications through our Facebook page, or any social media would be of benefit, and stories or articles in our newsletter highlighting volunteer opportunities. And our newsletter is just a quarterly publication. It's not an every month thing. Pre-COVID, we would also have sign-up sheets at any speaking events that we would list, and we'd get people to sign up there who are interested in doing some sort of volunteer work. So we kind of reach out in a lot of different places, and then just word of mouth from our volunteers like to bring in friends, and they let other people in their social groups know. And so that's one of the best ways to kind of spread the word and bring in volunteers. Now, the types of volunteers that we actually use are kind of two main categories: our in-house volunteers and then our eVolunteers. I'm going to focus on talking about our in-house volunteers, and then we'll turn it over to Daniel to talk about our eVolunteers. And our eVolunteers are a very large core, whereas we work on a slightly smaller scale for our in-house volunteers. In-house, we have three different main types of volunteers. So we've kind of split it out so it's more manageable for us and can be supervised in different ways. So our reference volunteers, processing volunteers, and then docents for helping with tours. So our reference volunteers assist with copies and research. We have research queues and copy queues, and the volunteers can help with that. Within this subcategory, we have some volunteers who are more comfortable with certain types of research or certain types of copies. So we make an effort to try to manage who does what to make sure that everyone has work. So as an example of this, we have some volunteers who only want to do the copies. The way our function works, as the state archives, we get hundreds of requests a month. We put everything in the research queue. We don't charge for research, but we don't make copies until we receive payment, and we do charge for copies. So we have a separate copy queue. Once we have found it, we let you know we have it, how much it's going to cost, and then you send in payment and it goes into the copy queue. And the copy queue does not last nearly as long as the research queue because we already know where things are. So some volunteers feel very comfortable coming in and copying paper records or copying microfilm records that they already know exactly where they are, exactly what they have to copy, and they're more than happy to do that. So we have some volunteers who just want to do that. Other volunteers will do whatever we have available to them. They have no problem sifting through deed index pages or marriage indexes, or reading through a list of people, like records that are in alphabetical order, to find the right person. They're happy to do that. And so we have to pay attention if our copy queue is getting low and we know so-and-so is coming in and only wants to do copies, to not let someone else do those copies and to focus on the research or things like that. So we do try to make an effort, because otherwise the volunteers who only like doing copies will stop coming in if other people are always doing the copies, even though they're willing to do the research. So we try to balance that. It can get a little bit hard when you have situations like that because we're dependent on the requests people have sent in to us if we don't have a lot of copies. So we'll try to give someone a call and say, hey, we don't have a lot of copies this week. So if you want to wait till next week to come in, things like that. We are currently averaging 400 to 600 requests a month, which is why reference volunteers are super helpful for us because our staff can only get those out so fast. I will say that within those requests, only about 50% would go into the queue for volunteers to assist with. Some are super easy for us to answer, or we point them to something online, or there's something that has to be answered pretty quickly because they're from a state agency or there's a legal need, and so we do them faster. But that's still sending 200 to 300 into our queue every month. Staff do work on the queue as well. It's not just volunteers, but when we have volunteers helping us, it does allow us to move through them faster. The way we do it to allow the volunteers to assist us is that we have paper copies of all the requests in queue folders by week so that we can work on the oldest that have come in first. And then the volunteers note what they've done and what they found and put it into a copied or research completed folder. And then staff finish it out. Staff actually respond from our email account. We don't give our volunteers access to our email account. If you're a volunteer-based organization, that might not be something that you have to worry about. But since we have security issues in IT department, they don't have access to that. So staff responds or physically mails out the copies. And we also like to double check that, especially with the copies, that everything is there, that the copies look good, that they didn't miss something or copy the wrong file or something like that. We always double check. One benefit to our reference volunteers compared to some of our other volunteers is it is more flexible scheduling. They can volunteer whenever we're open. When we're a little bit less restricted, currently with social distancing restrictions, we can only have 4 researchers in our reference room at a time, and that does include volunteers. So we do have to more closely schedule the times they're coming and make sure we have enough space for them. But otherwise, if they want to change up their hours and come in on a Monday afternoon one week and on a Thursday morning the next week, it's fine. As long as staff are here, there's always research that can be done. There's always copies that can be done. So for reference point of view, it's more flexible scheduling than we allow for our processing or docent volunteers. So when we talk about our processing volunteers, these are the volunteers who help us make the records in our collection more accessible, whether it's processing it just to get them organized and with a basic box folder inventory and a finding aid that we put online, or if it's preparing it so it could be microfilmed and digitized so they can go online. Both of those are considered processing projects. Our big one is death certificates, and that's the first working day of January. We actually often have lots of processing volunteers who come in just for that day. They don't process or volunteer any other day of the year. Whereas we also pull some of our reference volunteers for that day because it's kind of an all hands on deck thing because we want to get those available. For those of you not familiar with the Missouri State Archives or with genealogy or historic records like that, the death certificates open up. They're closer to 50 years, after which they're transferred to the Missouri State Archives. We process them, scan them, put them online to be indexed by our eVolunteers, and then they go into our online database. We get millions of hits on that one database every single month. So they're a very high demand project, which is why we do it so quick and why we pull in so many volunteers on that one project. This year was a little different than normal. We did have limited volunteers and fewer space, and so pulled more staff in. But that's kind of our big processing project. But we do various other projects over the years, kind of depends on our need. One of the things that we've really had to take into consideration when we're picking projects to be done by the volunteers is we want to include projects that they will find interesting, because you can lose projects or you can lose volunteers if you put them on projects that don't interest them. We have discovered that they are willing to do boring projects in between interesting projects, so we can get some of like the housekeeping type projects done in between, especially if the boring projects are smaller. But we've definitely discovered that that's a trend, is if you give them something really interesting, then you can stick something less interesting that just needs to be done in between, and then go back to something interesting. We do sometimes have volunteers that help us with digitization projects, and I definitely think that this is something that can be very beneficial to a smaller institution. We're very lucky in that our volunteers we have a full imaging lab, so we don't really need the volunteers. Our equipment tends to be being used fairly regularly by full-time staff. But we do have some digitization projects. We fairly regularly have one volunteer who's been a long-term volunteer, so we're aware of what she can do. And she digitizes a lot of photo projects for us. And so digitization is another useful aspect of pulling in a volunteer. I would definitely say more than any other, you would need to maybe evaluate the skill level of the volunteers you want to pull in to do that. And you very specifically need to have a very detailed project plan and formats and things like that that you want to have with that digitization plan if you're going to be overseeing a volunteer doing digitization. We have more specific times of the week that processing projects can be worked on. Processing requires a bit more space, and we have one large processing area, and so we have to schedule time in it. So we limit our processing projects for the most part. Death certificates supersede everything, and that will be done whatever day is the first business day. But in general, Monday afternoons and Wednesday mornings are our current processing project time period, and that allows other staff to use that space, or if we have interns or any other kind of projects going on, we can use that space for other things at other times. And so we do limit the processing time. With processing more than reference volunteers, we need to be able to oversee the project, see where we're at, bring records in, depending on the size of collection, will kind of vary how much space they need. But we do have to take into consideration the space management aspect of having processing volunteers. And so we kind of monitor that a little bit more. When you're selecting projects, if you haven't done it before, you for sure want to start small. It really helps both volunteers and staff to actually finish a project and see a project being done. And so that's kind of a lesson to be learned, is the ability to finish a project just energizes people. Look at, like, this is now available. They get excited when we put a finding aid online, or we write an article about, hey, there's this cool new collection available thanks to the volunteers that you can use, and here's how it works. We also focus on projects that are simple or have very defined rules. So we have a lot of things that have been done that are, put this in alphabetical order, put it in numerical order, like the death certificates are numerical by certificate number, or put it in chronological order. Or we do a lot of court records projects, and we actually have volunteers around the state through our local records program that help with some of those. And those just have very defined rules. You write these things on the folder, and then you organize the documents by filing date. Sometimes there's a little bit more information, but they're very defined, even though they might not be as easy and often require a little bit more reading than some of the other projects. And then we look at either high demand collections or collections that can't be used until processed. When I first started here in 2010, volunteers had just started processing the World War II reports of separation. We only had 2 volunteers at that time, and they're like, or two processing volunteers. And they were concerned about how long it would take. That collection, we ended up with like 36 volunteers, and it took 18 months working on it at various points in time. So with 2 of them, it would have taken a really long time. So we had to kind of evaluate, and that's where we started advertising and working with the DAR to bring in some people to kind of work on that project. And military records do tend to be a project that volunteers find interesting. and are willing to do over and over again. And then in terms of collections that can't be used until processed, our volunteers recently finished up processing our Missouri State Fair collection, which is one of the harder collections they've ever had to process because there was multiple types of records for every year. And some were really easy because they were just put this in alphabetical order, but then they'd have to switch and put something into chronological order within the same year and within the same record series. But the state fair records, because nothing had been in chronological or alphabetical order, except for they were roughly organized by fair year, we couldn't use it. People could come in and look through it on their own, but no one could send us a letter and say, hey, we're looking for information on our grandmother's entry in 1923, because we weren't going to read through all the 1923 stuff, and nothing was organized by type of entry or alphabetical by name. And now they are. And so we can actually search it. So we kind of rotate between the types of collections, either high demand or just unusable, but could be of interest and do get requests. It's super important to provide very clear instructions, particularly for new volunteers or new project types. We have some instructions in the past that we've written out for death certificates, but pre-COVID, we would usually just set a new volunteer right next to a long-term volunteer and have them kind of learn that way. But this year, because you can't sit right next to someone, we had to make sure that we had the paper instructions. And we pulled a lot of staff in that had never done it before. And so we had to do that. Or you get a new project type, like a new court record project that no one's worked on and has all these details. You want to have very clear instructions. Sometimes we do the same thing over and over again. So we're a little bit more lax in terms of writing up detailed instructions on every project. We've done so many military projects that we don't necessarily provide a new written set of instructions for it unless we have a bunch of new volunteers. But we will write out and completely process like 2 or 3 folders so staff can see or have a sample to know what it is that we want them to write on the folders and how it works. So I've mentioned a few of the projects we've done, but we've also done, like currently the volunteers are working on Crawford County probate records. They've done some circuit court records in the past. I mentioned the World War II reports of separation. They've also done Naval Militia Service files. And then we throw in the election returns aren't interesting, but they're super, they get requested a lot on our end. And then they're really, really easy and takes them about 2 days. And so we can throw that in there. And we did some Attorney General opinions that were super boring. That one did take more than 2 days, but they were willing to do it because it was in between 2 interesting ones. And the state fair definitely got a little bit of a struggle for them at the end, but they were powering through. When they got done and could go look in the stacks and see 4 full tiers of 400 boxes, all nicely labeled, they felt very proud of themselves. So it's kind of a give and take there. Docents are the volunteers we use the least. We provide tours to students in the spring on our Archives Alive program days, which are usually about 7 days a year. So it's a very limited time commitment. But it's also what's hardest for us to find volunteers for. So I don't necessarily have the best recommendations for finding docent volunteers. Our biggest problem is there's actually a lot of competition for docents, for the types of people who are willing to talk to students and lead them around places. There's a lot of competition here in Jeff City. We have docents at the Capitol, docents at the Governor's Mansion, docents at the State Penitentiary. And so there's a lot of a competition there. So that has been our biggest struggle, is finding docents. For the docents, we did create a docent handbook that includes talking points for each station to help them kind of learn what it is they're talking about. But that is also very helpful for training new staff. So it wasn't necessarily a waste for us. It allows us to provide training for anyone who's doing the tours, whether they're a volunteer or staff. Unfortunately, lately it's been more staff. Well, lately we haven't been giving any tours because of COVID, but we're hoping 2022 spring we'll be able to welcome some of the students back into the archives and give them tours because we do miss them. Managing volunteers, so much of what we get done is done because of volunteers. So we're super appreciative. But people need to be aware that managing volunteers does take time. You need to have a person designated to be in charge of the volunteers. Because we have different type of volunteers, we have different people who manage different types of volunteers. We have one person who kind of oversees the day-to-day activities of the reference volunteers, someone who does the processing, someone who does the eVolunteers. You'll talk to Daniel here in a minute. And different processing projects might have different supervisors too. So if we have a special project that one archivist came to us and said, hey, we could use the docents, the volunteers to help with this, they'll be the one to oversee that, as opposed to myself. Because they're the ones who'll need to come up with a plan and answer questions. And so we kind of do it that way. So you can spread the process, you can spread the supervision out depending on the type of volunteers you're doing. You want to determine how many volunteers you can manage. You don't want to open your doors and bring in 10 volunteers if you don't have the staff to manage 10 volunteers. You might want to start off just 1 or 2 volunteers, or like scale it at different times of the year, or depending on the projects you're doing. So you definitely want to consider how many volunteers that you can manage with the time you have. And you might want to determine what skill sets you need for your volunteers. If you really need digitization volunteers, you might want to have like more of an application process to be a volunteer. Or if you're trying to figure out what type of projects that they will work on, being aware of what their skills are. Are they good with typing? Are they good with QCing and data entry stuff? Or are they best suited to doing kind of basic handwriting stuff? Do they have abysmal handwriting so you don't want them labeling your folders? These are all things that you kind of want to consider. Do you need to set specific hours like we do with our processing, but not so much with our reference? You can kind of determine that. And do you want to request a minimum number of hours? For our reference, we say whenever you want to come in, however much you want to come in, it doesn't really matter. For our processing, we don't set a minimum, like a straight up minimum, you have to do this many hours a year. We're pretty flexible. We want you to feel comfortable giving time to us. You're not getting paid. But if you are going to come in, you need to come in for about 2 hours, because otherwise you're not going to get much done. Because by the time you get the project out, get settled into it, if you're only planning to be here for an hour, you're going to be cleaning up after yourself and not get much done. So we do set, if you come in, you need to do at least 2 hours of work. But that doesn't mean you have to come in every week or twice a week or even every other week. You can kind of set your schedule with us. It helps us to know. We generally know that you're only coming in on the Monday afternoons, as opposed to you're only coming in on Wednesday mornings. You come in every other week. We do like to know, but we're not going to be like, you can't volunteer if you don't come in those hours. But so you want to kind of decide if you want to have a requirement, or if you want to have a requirement at all. That's useful to know. The other thing is you should keep statistics on your volunteers and your volunteer hours. We track the number of hours and volunteers by month. So like this month, say we had 7 volunteers total and they put in 13 hours. And by project. So we can say this processing project took this many volunteers and this many hours. They're very useful for annual reports and for funding requests. If you have a funding institution that you have to report back to, it can be useful for that. Or in our case, we use it in certain grant applications to provide additional information about why funding is helpful to us, and things like that. So tracking the hours that the volunteers put in and which projects they work on is super important. So all of our volunteers fill out this record of volunteer service. We have a folder for each of them. When they leave for the day, they just stop by, note down the number of hours. We always like round to the nearest quarter hour. We're not being super exact. And just which project they were working on, whether it's reference or which processing project. And then we create a spreadsheet for each different project. And then we track it for the whole length of the project and add it up. So for example, our World War II reports of separation that I mentioned, we ended up having 36 volunteers total. Not all of them worked every month. Some came in at the tail end, some kind of left earlier on. And over 18 months, those 36 volunteers put in over 3,200 hours to finish that project, which was 323 Hollinger boxes of records of Missouri soldiers who served during World War II. And this is a very, very high use collection. especially with the fire in St. Louis. And so we use this to say, look, this would have taken a full-time staff member 18 months to do, with them doing nothing else, like nothing else. And so we've been able to use this stat a number of times when we're talking to people in our administration about how important volunteers are, or why certain records aren't necessarily processed yet. We can point out how long certain things take. And then we do make a pretty strong effort to show our appreciation for our volunteers, because again, not much gets done. I mean, some stuff gets done, but not a ton gets online without volunteers. April is volunteer month, so we always like to throw a party when we can be in person. Apparently I forgot to finish spelling out person. So I'm not quite sure what we're going to do this April, but I'm sure we'll find a way to thank them. We like to give shout outs in social media or newsletters when projects are completed or milestones are met. And the social media shout outs and the newsletter shout outs are super useful for recruiting more volunteers, especially for recruiting eVolunteers. And so with that note, I'm going to actually turn this over to Daniel so he can talk more specifically about our eVolunteers.
Thanks, Christina. And Daniel, you should be able to just pull up your PowerPoint and do your share screen. There we go.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about the eVolunteer portion. So our eVolunteer program at the Missouri State Archives was started in 1999, long before I had gotten here. I was hired in 2016 and became the eVolunteer in 2018, so I've been at this a couple of years. I'm going to give you some numbers here just to kind of give you the scope of what we're looking at here at the Missouri State Archives. We have about 1,600 eVolunteers on our email list. So as Christina said, it is quite a large group of people. And right now we're currently indexing 1970 death certificates. And as you can see there, there's about 150 to 250 people that log in each death certificate year when we get a new project up. And right now we've had about 240 eVolunteers that have worked on the 1970 death certificate collection. And I thought it was interesting, I noted there that 50 of those volunteers have transcribed at least 500 death certificates. So that's a pretty sizable amount. If you're a pretty fast typer and pretty effective, you can do maybe 35 certificates an hour. So some people are putting in some serious time. We actually have a couple people that have done about 6,000 a piece. So quite large numbers. And then I got some other statistics here. In 2019 and 2020, so the 2020 death certificate number you see there, 146,000 death certificates indexed, all done by eVolunteers. That was just for 2020. And then the numbers below that, we're also working on World War I bonus claims, which is a project that we're about to wrap up, which is great. We're over 90% done on that. There were about 167,000 of those done in 2019 and 2020 combined. And then in addition, I'll also talk a little bit later here about the Missouri State Penitentiary Project, which is an ongoing project because it covers such a large range of years. And what those are registered books that were recorded the names of people that were entered into the Missouri State Penitentiary. So we have eVolunteers going through and indexing information off those pages. And we've actually gotten about 3,000 additional pages of those done in 2019 and 2020 combined. Okay, so I mentioned a couple of our projects on the previous page. So we have the death certificates that are ongoing. So we do a new year each year. The first day in January they arrive. So next year we would get 1971. Christina talked a little bit about that process. But also in addition, we have eVolunteers going back and re-indexing years, and we're working our way backwards. And we do that, we re-index years so we can add the name of the deceased person's spouse and their parents. So we're trying to give people more information on our database page that they can search by. So that's kind of an ongoing project that we do as well until we get all the way back to 1910. I think our next one will be 1955, if I'm not mistaken. So we have quite a ways to go, but it's another project that eVolunteers will be working on. We have Missouri Marriage Project, but that's through Family Search, so that's a little bit different. I won't talk much about it here, but we do that in conjunction with Family Search, where people can log in through their Family Search account and index the Missouri marriages that are out there. And a couple of the other projects that we're currently doing are the Missouri State Penitentiary, which I mentioned, and the World War I bonus claims, which are about to wrap up. All right, so if you were to go, if you're not really familiar with our page, this is our Missouri Death Certificate database. It actually covers 1910 to 1969 right now, and we're currently working on 1970, so that should be added hopefully soon. We are actually about 74% complete on the indexing. I'm able to track that behind the scenes, so we're 3/4 of the way done there. So if the end user were to go out to our Missouri Death Certificate database, they would see this page that you see here in front of you. All right, and then this is what our eVolunteer page looks like. So if you go to the Missouri Secretary of State website, over along the left side, you'll see a banner with some different links to click on. And if you were to click on the volunteers link, you would be brought to this page that says volunteer opportunities. So we have an eVolunteer login there that you can click on, which would then show you, would bring up the eVolunteer login page. So that's kind of where the eVolunteers are able to go set up their account. And once they do that and log in successfully, they're going to log in and it's going to look like this. And over along the left, we have projects that they can click on to work on. That is usually going to be the transcribed death certificates. That's where they would click to transcribe. And then below that, you might notice a button that says instructions. It's pretty important to have those instructions out there. We want our volunteers to read them. And we also send out emails announcing our new death certificate project each year or each time that one goes up. And we also include instructions and tips on indexing in that email as well. But it's also helpful to have the instructions out there for volunteers so they can click on that when they run into a trouble certificate that they're not quite sure how to index it, and answer some common questions that they might run into. All right, so once they log in and click transcribe death certificates, it brings up a window that looks like this, which, as Christina said, once those death certificates are processed, they do get scanned by our imaging lab, and then these images get uploaded so the eVolunteers can index them. So when they log in and click transcribe death certificates, they're going to see this. And then the fields that they have to answer before they can submit the certificate to move on to the next one are usually marked with the red asterisk. And they have to fill those in before they can go on to the next one, and then they click submit, and it would just bring up a new certificate from there. Now, a little bit behind the scenes, this is what I see when I log in to do some of the administration on the administration side of the death certificates. So we've got about 1,600 volunteers, as we said, and a few hundred of those are working on death certificates. So as they're doing them, it's tracking their statistics on this page. And as you can see up there, it tells me what percentage we're at, so I can kind of track where we're at in the project. And then it tracks the number of images that have been transcribed, how accurate we are, so we can kind of track things there as well. If we're running into common problems, we can kind of address those. And you see kind of in the middle of the page, there's a place that says meeting admin review. That's one of the most important things we do on the backside of the death certificates. And I'll click ahead here. So when we click on the certificates that need to be adminned by us, and what happens here is we have a double blind system where each certificate gets checked by at least 2 people. And if those 2 people agree on all the fields, then that certificate goes through and is approved. But if they were to flag if one of those people were to flag it with a note, like missing name, missing a date, anything in the notes field, or if those 2 people didn't agree on something, then it would go to a third person. And then that third person, if they don't agree with one of the other people, then it comes through to us as an admin certificate, or if there's a note, it comes through to us automatically. So you can see kind of down through there, you get to check each person's transcription. And this would be done on our side, you know, as the staff or the archives volunteer, the archives employees, not volunteers. We get to look through this and see, you know, double check it with the image above and then choose the right transcription. And sometimes all three people miss something, which is fine too. That fourth column gives us the ability to correct it and submit a new one altogether. So right now on the 1970 ones, there's a couple thousand of these that we're going through. So it can get pretty time consuming. So we try to correct mistakes as we go. So one of the wonderful things about being able to do this admin side of this project is we can kind of catch trends that people are having trouble with, problem areas that somebody might have, because it's not included on here, but down below, we can actually see the 3 users who submitted these. So if we notice one person, if we noticed an eVolunteer who's having problems with a particular thing, entering something wrong, we usually try to send them an email and thank them for volunteering. And also, you know, hey, by the way, can we try to work on this or correct this? So we try our best to kind of stay in communication with people and fix some of those problems that are kind of consistent. So we also have a lot of other databases that have been created primarily by eVolunteers. Pre-1910 Births and Deaths and Missouri State Penitentiary, which are both databases out on our website, were built by eVolunteers or were indexed by eVolunteers. The Missouri State Penitentiary one is actually ongoing, so we're still adding years to that. And once we get those spreadsheets approved and stuff, we would send them up to IT and get that information added to the database. So that's kind of a project that's ongoing. And also many of our in-house indexes were built by eVolunteers as well, such as the Supreme Court Basement Case File Index and some WP indexes or Works Progress Administration. And then we use images and Excel templates emailed out to our eVolunteers. So the death certificates, you notice the volunteer can go log in and work on those. When we start talking about the Missouri State Penitentiary stuff and the bonus claim collection, I actually have digital images that I send out to the eVolunteers. And then I created an Excel template. We've got an Excel template that tells them which information to enter in. And we've also built instructions for those projects as well, so we can send them copies of that. That kind of tell them, you know, these are the fields that we're indexing. This is what you need to look for. And we try to be consistent with, you know, from volunteer to volunteer. Once they enter the information on the spreadsheet, the Excel spreadsheet that I send them, they just email it back to me as an attachment. And then I have a place where I can go in and say that I usually try to check them over for accuracy, although I mean, it would be awful time consuming to check each one. But we try to maintain like the same kind of date format and things like that to keep consistent. We then take those spreadsheets and combine them into one long spreadsheet. So for example, the bonus claims, all the surnames starting with B go into one spreadsheet, and we do that for each letter of the alphabet and the surnames on that. And then on the Missouri State Penitentiary, we take a particular volume, like volume 15, we take all those spreadsheets and combine them to create one large spreadsheet for volume 15. These images and Excel templates are a pretty feasible option for starting out, especially for smaller institutions, because you don't really have to have any fancy software or anything like that to do a large scale project. If you've got a small project, you can find a way to get images to your eVolunteers and then give them a template to go off of and some instructions, and they can be indexing the information that you want them to pretty quick. Okay, so I mentioned those spreadsheets. So what you see here is a Missouri State Penitentiary image that's been digitized, a page that's been digitized. And below that, you would see what the Excel template would look like. So the eVolunteer would then take the information on the page above, transcribe it into the Excel sheet that you see below, and that's the completed sheet that they send back to me. And I should also mention, we do use a share file program, a program called ShareFile, which allows us to share images and large files with our eVolunteers and with patrons when we need to for those sorts of things. But it allows me to basically upload a couple of pages of Missouri State Penitentiary Register books and then send those out to the volunteer along with the spreadsheet, and then they can send me the spreadsheet back. And once they do that, if they want to continue with the project, we just repeat that process where we send them a new batch of images, usually 10 pages is what I do. And because there's 7 names per page, so that gives people plenty to work on. And when they complete it, they send it back to me. All right, so Christina kind of touched on this earlier, but I'll touch on it as well because we're talking about a different group of volunteers here. But most of our eVolunteers, this might not apply as much, but a lot of them are former school teachers, hobbyists, people with local history, genealogy interest. And something else we get a lot of is we get students as well, university students. We get a lot of those on our eVolunteer program. To get credit for classes, they can do projects through me. They can also log on and do death certificates as well to get some volunteer hours there that way. So we do get students as well. The mostly Missourians things doesn't apply to the eVolunteers as much, although we do, we get them from all over the country and all over the world. We do also get some crossover from family search volunteers. And Facebook is kind of one of those things we started to advertise. We've got a new year of death certificates starting now. Sign up. But the person who does the post is very good about contact our archives volunteer coordinator to set up an account. So we try to pull people in from social media as well. And we try to do that not just at the beginning of the death certificate cycle, but we'll do it like halfway through, 2/3 of the way through, 3/4, something kind of, we've hit a milestone in the completion. We're halfway done with the 1970 certificates, and we might make a Facebook post about it, asking people to sign on, asking for help. And people are usually really receptive of that sort of thing, and it draws in their interest and they want to help out. So those work out really well. So once you have them interested, keeping their interest is also important. Usually, as my job as the eVolunteer coordinator, I do send out an email, a mass email, 1 or 2 times a month. And then we also mention more with individuals there because our volunteer account has its own email account. So we get to answer questions. I deal with a lot of questions about, I'm indexing a death certificate and I have this question, or we get people wanting to sign up and I give them instructions on how to do that. And usually we send out an email once our death certificate project is complete. And I get a lot of interest because I will try to mention something. If you helped out with the death certificate, you may be interested in this. And I'll mention like the Missouri State Penitentiary project or the bonus claim project. And that works out really well. With that, we get a lot of interest after I send that email out. Hey, I helped with the 1969 death certificates. I would love to help with the Missouri State Penitentiary project. So kind of mentioning those things to your volunteers that you do have out there working on things, let them know, hey, this project's also available, works really well for us. We do have a volunteer reception every year, although the pandemic did postpone last year's and we didn't get to have it. So hopefully we get back to that soon. And that helps with having a face and name that keeps their interest. They get to see me, they get to see the state archivist, John Dugan, they get to see Christina at that sort of thing. And they get to interact with us and have conversations. And it's just a good way to put a face with the person you've been communicating with. I've actually met some of my eVolunteers in person, so it's nice to put a name with a face on my side as well. We do small prize giveaways at those usually, where we'll have small door prizes that they can win, and all the way up to some pretty nice things. And actually the last couple of years, we've had like a volunteer of the year, an eVolunteer of the year, a volunteer of the year award that's been given out. So that goes to somebody that's getting recognized that year for all the work they have done. And then we try to have a variety of projects going on at the same time. Like I said, we have the bonus claims in Missouri State Penitentiary. We get a lot of interest in the death certificates because people get so excited about getting a new year up. But a lot of them want to work on something interesting, something different. So Missouri State Penitentiary kind of fills that void when a death certificate project's been completed. And we also try to choose things that might be not as complicated, something more complicated and something less complicated with this, like the amount of information you have to input. The bonus claims is pretty simple. It's just kind of names and dates. The MSP stuff is a lot more complicated in Missouri State Penitentiary because there are a lot more fields to index and things like that. So having that variety of projects helps your volunteers kind of where they're at. You know, some people don't want to work on the Missouri State Penitentiary because it's kind of tedious and a lot more information and more time consuming. They might not have that kind of time. So giving them something that's a little less heavy helps out. Okay, so keeping track of projects kind of on my end. So this is kind of some things that I've done to keep track. This is a Microsoft Access database. You can also do this with Excel spreadsheets as well. But basically describing the project, giving it a project name, these are some of the column headings you would want on here. And then you'll see the status there, like this batch that I sent out is in progress, this has been completed. And then give it a description of as to what you sent out. So for example, on those correction records you see there and inmates received, that's the Missouri State Penitentiary stuff. So giving it the volume 5, disc 4, pages 125 through 190 or whatever, that gives it a description so I know on my end that this volunteer is working on this group of pages on this volume. And I also try to put a date that I sent it and then a date that it was returned. The date sent's kind of important. If you've got something that's been out there a while and you want to send that volunteer an email and reach out to them, just let them know, hey, how's it going? Do you have any questions? They're usually pretty receptive and will answer you back, or hey, I just don't have the time to work on this. Can I send you what I've completed? Which does happen from time to time, but keeping track on your end helps you out, reaching out to the volunteers, seeing where they're at with the project, and then they can move forward and you can move forward if they don't have the time to put in, things like that. So that's kind of what we do. We do it with the Access databases and with Excel spreadsheets. They both kind of work the same way. So it's really helpful. All right, deciding project priorities. We usually try to think of what would be of most use to our users. What new databases are we building? These are things you can ask yourself in your organization. What are we building that needs data to populate it? And then what collections do we access the most that a name index would be helpful? The best example there is the death certificates for us. As Christina mentioned, it gets millions of hits a month. So the fact that we have that index out there, that database, is very helpful. And the same kind of thing with the Missouri State Penitentiary register pages. It's such a heavy use collection that it's helpful to spend the time with eVolunteers indexing it so we can build that database up and protect our records by having it out there for people to see and access online. And then you want to decide the specifics of your indexing project. For example, do you want to index off an index, or do you want a full transcription of the record? So the Missouri State Penitentiary records we're doing, that's a full transcription. Whereas the older death certificate years that we have, that database was built off an index. And that's why we're going back now and re-indexing years to add the parents' names and spouses' names to get a little bit more information out there that people can search by. What items will be searched? Some things might not be searched. When you look at your collections, there might be fields on some of them that might not be as important for end users when it comes to searching. And what is the most important data that researchers that would be beneficial to them? You kind of got to think about different types of researchers on this one. Think of your genealogists and historians, and also think of your academic researchers. Some of what we're doing for the MSP indexing, a lot of academic researchers are going to find useful later on once that project's completed. So just kind of think about those things. And then what information is helpful to view just at a glance. And always keep in mind your staff time and your volunteers' time. As Christina mentioned with the World War I reports of separation, and most recently with the eVolunteers and the bonus claims, it's taken quite a few people a lot of time to get that done. And then it takes a lot of staff time to double check their work and combine those spreadsheets. So just things that you have to keep in mind with those kinds of projects. Project ideas. I kind of mentioned it on the previous slide, but you're going to want to think about what people use. Think about the genealogist and the academics alike. And that's kind of what, these are kind of some of the projects that we chose based on those ideas, what genealogists might use in academics. We have the Supreme Court Basement Case File Index, Coroner's Inquest, military records, working on the bonus claims, and we've also done enlistment and service records. Missouri State Penitentiary, as I've mentioned, is ongoing. And some of those WPA indexes were also useful when we thought about what genealogists would want in academics. Think about all possible angles of research. What we kind of mean by that is you want to think about not just the genealogist, think about the academic as well, because they're oftentimes after different information than a family historian is. So just what would benefit those users and the most. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Christina. I think she wanted to talk briefly about From the Page.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I know we're running short on time. This is mostly for those of you who wanted to do something that's a little bit more internet-based instead of just the Excel or imaging. From the Page is an open source software, so you can download it, like install it on your own servers for free. But you can also host projects on here for very minimal cost. So if you're interested in some sort of like online crowdsourcing, I would check out From the Page as a viable option for smaller institutions. We have not used them yet, although we are currently collaborating with them and a number of other state archives to update the software so that we can do ledger style transcriptions for things like the state penitentiary record books. Whereas right now they're set up more for like death certificates and or transcribing whole letters. But it's definitely a website that you might want to check out because it could be very useful for crowdsourcing volunteers on a smaller scale.
Perfect. All right, that's all I've got for the eVolunteer portion. That's just our contact information if you wanted to take a look at it. There's the ArcVol email that I mentioned, our own volunteer email account, and my personal email as well. So that's all I have.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Christina. I actually have not had any questions pop up, which is a first. So I think you guys had a lot of great information, and I think people are just curiously taking notes. But if any last minute questions start to filter in, we'll take those. But in the meantime, I'll kind of start to wrap us up here. So again, Christina and Daniel, thank you so much from Missouri State Archives. It's great to hear from a program that's had successful volunteers for so long. I think volunteers are something that are used so frequently in a lot of small communities in our state, especially small cultural institutions. So I hope people can take something with them from this. We do have a question actually just popped up. What is the typical learning curve for a volunteer?
I would say it's going to vary volunteer to volunteer and project to project. eVolunteers, they usually pick it up pretty quickly. I mean, again, it depends on the type. The hardest thing with sometimes with eVolunteers is they want to put in more information than we need, or they want to correct the record, which we don't always want to do. Like if it just has the middle initial and you've looked it up on Find a Grave and know that their middle initial actually stands for Marie, we don't actually want to do that because we can't verify that. With processing or in-house volunteers, it's a lot, it's more of them getting into the groove of it. Some projects, like I said, we tend to pick easier projects. So they tend to, pick it up after a couple times. This is why we've preferred to have people work with someone as part of training. Like if you're new to a processing project, we want to sit you down next to a volunteer who's been doing it for 2 years and have you learn from them because they pick it up faster as opposed to just relying on written instructions. But we've had to kind of modify that a little bit because we can't have people working so closely together this year. And so it really depends on the type of volunteer. Some volunteers pick things up so fast because they've worked, like, you know, we get librarians as volunteers. We have a number of retired librarians, and so they're very good at doing research. Or people who've done a lot of genealogy, as opposed to other people who just saw our ad in the paper and want to volunteer and do something and are happy to come out and read through some records, but haven't really done it before. And so they sometimes might take a little bit longer. But it really just depends on the volunteer and depends on the project. So that's a really hard one to answer.
And a comment from Laura, great information, was glad you drilled down somewhat. It helped to see examples, and volunteers really do like to be acknowledged. Publishing the collective number of hours they contributed shows their impact. So thank you. Very true. You know, it's very nice to see people just, you know, willingly dedicating their time, especially to an institution like the State Archives. So no more questions coming in, it looks like. So I'll go ahead and wrap us up. Remember that you will have a survey pop up on your screen after the conclusion of the webinar in just a minute. Please take some time to complete that. It's not very long. We really do enjoy all of our surveys and take a lot of the information to heart. So these are very important for us. They don't just go in a drawer somewhere. This, in addition to the other 2 webinars for the day, will be available on our Facebook page, the recorded version, under the videos tab. And I would say sometime next week, all 3 webinars will be available on our video archive on our website, mohumanities.org, as well as our YouTube channel, which is Missouri Humanities Council. So again, thank you, Christina. Thank you, Daniel. We will go ahead and end the webinar for the day. Thank you to everyone that joined us throughout the day today. And we hope to see you all again soon. Thank you guys. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.